This is episode 469 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Well, you may be aware that Kevin McCarthy recently was, I believe, on the 15th vote named Speaker of the House in Washington, D.C., but right here in New Mexico, well, the Democrats control the legislature, but we have the newly minted minority leader of the legislature coming to you in this particular show, and we're very excited to have Representative Ryan Lane, who is in that position. So welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Ryan.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate it. I guess the 15th time is the charm, maybe, at least at the federal level. But and also congrats on 469 episodes. That's very impressive as well.
Well, thank you. Yes, and we've been at it for a little while, and it's taken us till this point to get to talk to you. But that's partially because you haven't been in the legislature that long, and I know the process isn't quite like it is in Washington, D.C., but before we get started and talking about the upcoming session and all the issues on the table for New Mexico during the 2023 legislature, talk a little bit about yourself. We met up in the Four Corners. You're a Farmington guy. I know that, and you represent San Juan County, but what got you involved in politics, and how long have you been there? Because you're relatively new and relatively young in this whole mix.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I was born and raised in R-Aztec. So as a Tiger, we battle with the Scorpions in Farmington. So I'm not quite from Farmington, just a little bit east there.
Fair enough.
No, just a little sports high school jab there. So I was born and raised there, graduated from high school in 2000. And actually my folks were both born and raised in R-Aztec, went to high school there. My grandparents on both sides moved to San Juan County in the 40s and 50s, chasing the oil boom at that time. After high school, I went out of state for undergrad. I went and played baseball in college, got a bachelor's degree in math, and ended up going to law school out in Virginia. And then clerked for a state appellate judge and a federal district judge in Phoenix for a few years, and moved back home in 2010. And in 2013, opened up my own law practice. And besides that, my wife and I also own a craft ice cream shop in R-Aztec, which we've had for 6 or 7 years now. We have two sons, 20 and soon to be 17. And as far as how I got started in this, so I served on the R-Aztec School Board from 2015 to basically January of 2020. And during that time frame, my predecessor in District 3, which is my House district number, Paul Bandy, he served for 14 years, and he would come in periodically towards the end of his tenure and say, I think that you would be a good fit for this seat, because I had done some legal work for Paul on and off over the years. And I'd tell Paul, why don't you turn around and get the heck out of my office? I don't want to go serve down in Santa Fe in the minority when it's an unpaid position, and my plate's full as it is. And then eventually one day he came in and said, look, I'm definitely going to retire. I'm not going to run again. I really think, given your skill set, you'd be good for this. Why don't you come down to Santa Fe? This is the last session that he was going to be in, and sort of see how the sausage was made, so to speak. So I said, okay, I'll go down to the Capitol. So went down for a couple of days, watched him in committees, watched him on the floor, watched some other folks, talked to some members offline, behind the scenes, to kind of try to get my hands around what it really entailed, and realized at that point I thought actually this could be something that I'd be interested in doing. And my why is pretty simple. I have a very varied background. So I, like I said, we own a couple of businesses, we own real estate, I've been on the school board, I was born and raised here, coached youth sports, so many different things. And in addition to that, I've been involved in municipal politics, as I've been a municipal attorney since 2011. And so sort of all these backgrounds boxes were checked, and I thought this is the best way that I know to serve my community. And so that's a long-winded answer to your short question. So
Hey, I appreciate that. Now, I don't want to come out of left field here, but were you on the school board when there was that mass shooting at the Aztec High School?
Yes, that took place in 2017, December 2017. So I was on the school board during that time. Obviously, a very challenging time for our community. Not something anybody expects to happen in their town, let alone a little town of 6,000 people. So yeah, that was a challenging day for those two families and certainly our community.
Right. And talk a little bit about the four corners before we get into some of the broader issues. And you mentioned your family moved there for jobs or work in the industry. That's an area of our state. The Four Corners is traditionally a natural gas rich area. It's definitely had some great economic times, has more recently had some challenging times, but things seem to be moving in a better direction, especially with the price of natural gas being a little higher, a little more sustainable. Talk a little bit about your perch up there, especially since you guys are neighbors, kind of competing with Arizona, Utah, and Colorado for jobs and economic activity.
Yeah, so historically, as you said, the Salmon Basin has been primarily natural gas, and that has driven our economy for the most part. But I'm actually optimistic about the future here. I think we're very well positioned. Unfortunately, the power plants and the coal mines shutting down, those are high paying jobs that simply can't be replaced. So the folks in those families, they either have to choose to leave their area, leave their home, and go pursue something in, say, Wyoming, where that industry is still accepted, or they have to find a different job with lower pay. And so those jobs, I think, are suffering. But in terms of the economy itself, we do benefit because our cost of living here, as compared to Southern Colorado and Southeast Utah, is quite a bit lower, and we still offer many of the same opportunities in terms of recreation and outdoor opportunities. So I think that's been a big reason for the uptick in the local economy. The Farmington, is a decent sized town. And so it tends to have its own little economy as well. And so, yeah, I mean, we have our challenges certainly, but both of the price of natural gas and then sort of more of the outdoor environment, I think things are on the uptick here.
And I guess transitioning, you run a ice cream shop. Talk about challenges with that. I presume you, like everybody else, were shut down for a long time due to COVID. How was that whole situation for you as a business owner? And then now with it being so difficult to find people to work, how has that been? And we'll talk about the solutions and other challenges, but just more from the business perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, COVID, I think one of the frustrating things for me as someone who errs on the side of liberty is I don't think it's proper for a governor or the government generally to choose one business over another. And so when decisions were made to allow certain business to remain open and others had to close, I don't think that's okay. I think that's a violation of people's fundamental rights to make a living. And fortunately for us, we had a drive-through and a walk-up window, so we fit the exceptions that the governor had laid out. And so we were still able to remain open and keep our employees employed, which was great. Even we were closed, I'd have to go back and look, for a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks. I don't remember what that time frame was, and we didn't know exactly what we were looking for. And even then, we were able to keep our employees on payroll. We didn't have to let anybody go, thankfully. But as far as challenges go, I mean, the supply chain has been an issue for us. As far as employees go, I know restaurants, particularly soon after things started opening up, had a difficult time attracting employees. I will say, thankfully, we have a very good reputation in the community as taking care of our employees and really mentoring them. A lot of our employees are high school students and a handful of college students. So we do, I think, a good job of mentoring those students. Many of them, it's their very first job. And and the culture's good. And one of the perks of this job is you can have as much free ice cream as you want. So I think that helps in a small way as well.
There you go. That's a good one. All right. Well, that is a good way to lead into direct policy. And before I get into kind of all the specific things, bills are already being introduced to the legislature. But you are, as we pointed out at the beginning, minority leader, not majority leader or speaker in the case of, the House of Representatives, what they call the top dog there in charge. How do you see yourself as a Republican trying to influence the policy situation in New Mexico in a way that is more pro small business, just based on the numbers, not so much the policies themselves? Do you have any thoughts as to how to bring New Mexico a little bit more towards the center?
Well, unfortunately, right, wrong, or indifferent, I think New Mexico historically has had not a great reputation when it comes to being open for business. And we're a state where, basically half our population is on Medicaid. And I have to look at the exact numbers, but what I recall is a family of four, I think the median income is somewhere like in, 50 to 54,000 a year for a family of four. And I mention all of that because from my perspective, the surest way to help people escape poverty is through the free market system. We've seen that historically since the Industrial Revolution. The percentage of those that are impoverished has shrunken drastically over the last 150 years. And I think the data proves out that it's what happens when you go to a free market system. So the more that New Mexico can embrace that, the better it's going to be for us as her citizens. And so from my perspective, when we talk about business policies or business legislation, I think we need to make it easier for people that are entrepreneurial in spirit but don't necessarily have the capital. We need to make it easier for those folks to be able to take some risk. For folks that don't understand how to navigate the system, whether that's as simple as forming an LLC or how to file business taxes or any of those things, I think that's important as well. So as like I said, the more that we can let the market do its magic and have fewer governmental interferences when it comes to actual activities of business, still making sure that the consumer is protected, but finding a better balance there, I think, is important.
Yeah, no doubt. And so kind of connecting two strands that we've been talking about, it's been a priority of Republicans pretty much since the start of COVID. Representative Greg Nybert has introduced legislation with bipartisan support, although the Democrat who had supported the legislation to give the legislature a seat at the table during an emergency has left. But is that something that you would like to see happen? It honestly doesn't seem that partisan, but it with anything tends to become a partisan issue in Santa Fe.
Well, we shouldn't be shocked that an executive doesn't want to limit his or her power. I think that's the nature of the executive, and the flip side of that is the nature of the legislative branch, right? So we are the closest to the people, and it's designed that way intentionally, particularly the House. So, we serve 2-year terms, the Senate serves 4. At the federal level, it's 2 and 6. And so the design behind that is you want a body that's reactive, that's us, the House. That way we can be really responsive to issues that are going on with the people. And then you want the Senate to be more measured to make sure that we're actually passing good legislation. Well, when you have an emergency order and there is essentially isolated and exclusive control within a single person through the governor's office, you've now eliminated that whole system and you've eliminated the voice of the people. And so, I think fundamentally that's why we need to revisit how our system is currently set up in New Mexico. It's not about Democrat or Republican from my perspective. It's making sure that the people have a voice through their elected representatives and senators in times of emergency after, you know, a certain time frame. And I've heard a number of different proposals about what that looks like. And I think we can all agree and disagree on those. That's not really what I think should be the focus. It's realizing that 2+, 3+ years without consulting and involving the legislature is really at a base level cutting out the people. That's really the problem.
Any reason to believe that that issue may get more traction this session than it's had in previous years? Or do you think it's still just the Democrats are not going to challenge Lujan Grisham?
Well, I admire your optimism. I wish I shared it. So, you know, Democrats with a broad brush, as you said, there were Democrats that signed on, and there are Democrats that approved that. So it's not, you know, such a broad brush. I think it's maybe a handful of Democrats who oppose it and would kill it. But no, I don't see, even though I think those kind of bills need to be introduced, because at least we have a conversation, right? Like right now, you and I are talking about it. Whereas if those bills had never been introduced, there's a chance maybe we're not even talking about this and the public's unaware of it. So there is value in introducing legislation for a purpose, to at least have a conversation, even if it dies in the first committee. But I don't have a lot of optimism it's going to grow legs and get to the finish line.
All right. Well, that's too bad, but not a surprise. All right. Well, as a economic analyst, you know, we look at this session as really being dominated by the massive oil and gas surplus that is going to be, you know, at the disposal of the legislature when you get up there in a week or so. And, you know, we're talking $3.6 billion. It's massive, you know, 43 or so percent. If you spend it all over the current budget. So really just unprecedented amounts of money. Rio Grande Foundation's banged the drum over the years. I know Representative Jason Harper, another Republican member of your caucus, and he's also often had bipartisan support for gross receipts tax reform. What is there an overriding theme as to how you think the GOP would like to push the ball on tax reform or taxation issues up in Santa Fe? And you know, barring some conversion, you know, Saul on the way to Damascus conversion among the Democrats, how do you think actually things will go down regarding that massive amount of money?
So what I'm being told is there's about $1 billion in the framework of the budget for tax reform. And of course, you know, that may change once we get in the session and the actual budget bill is introduced and this goes through the process. But what I think there is a realistic chance of happening is really reforming that pyramiding system that you described, or business to business type taxes. And I'm sure you've talked about pyramiding on the show many times.
Oh yeah, you don't need to go into that. Otherwise, my producer Wally will begin the drinking game of the gross receipts tax, because we talk about that in so many different ways.
Yeah, so I do think though that there, you know, to your question, I think there is actually a realistic possibility of pyramiding being, if not eliminated, at least reformed in meaningful ways. I think you're going to see some traction around income tax brackets expanding, at least for the middle class. So that way, you know, because right now the way our system works is basically somewhere around 25 grand, you're like in the second highest tax bracket. And so if we could bring that one up, that would provide some relief for our middle income taxpayers. Of course, we got to be careful, because what I've heard also is rumors of there being a higher tax bracket introduced as well. And I don't think that's helpful. But to the extent that we can provide some relief for our middle income taxpayers, I think that's helpful. And I've heard, you know, a lot of movement around that as well. And then, you know, there's some discussions too about dropping the state rate of GRT, not at the municipal level or county level, but the state rate.
Okay, well, those are pretty good. I'm not gonna lie. That's actually reasonable tax policy. Obviously, details will be, you know, more specific and will really give us an idea if this is going to move the needle on New Mexico's economy. But it sounds like they're at least in the right ballpark in terms of some of these reform ideas. Would you generally agree to that, or what's your take?
Yeah, no, those ones that I mentioned are ones that we as Republicans, I think, by and large, would support and advance. There are other less helpful ones that I've heard of, but those are the ones that I think would make a meaningful impact in the day-to-day life of New Mexicans.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that we state clearly for the record that while there was a lot of good policy in there, raising the top rate for the personal income tax yet again would not be a good idea, not welcome, and on that very harmful. I know that you have a pretty progressive group up there on the other side of the aisle, but hopefully we can push back against that idea as well. It's hard to justify raising taxes, even on those mean old nasty rich business owners and business creators when you have this kind of surplus.
Yeah, and that's one of our themes, Paul, is we're awash in cash, and why are we even having a discussion about raising taxes in this environment, in this economy? We don't need the additional revenue right now, and so we have everything we need to budget, and so there's no need to go down that road.
All right, in terms of amount of money being spent, do you see a massive binge, or do you think there's going to be some restraint there based on the fact that we've already increased the budget? Do you see refunds or rebates as part of the plan as well? While not reform, it's certainly more welcome than just spending all that money or even putting it into some permanent fund. So where do you see some of those issues coming down?
Yeah, no, I think the budget's going to grow again. I guess people will differ about whether they think it's massive or not. I don't know what the percentages is right now. I haven't received an update recently. But I expect it'll be, 8, 9, 10%, somewhere in that frame would be my guess. I have heard, the governor has said that she would like to do rebates. And I think those are good, but they're not the greatest good. And so I'd like to see that money go towards meaningful tax reform. If that's not on the table, then I would lean more towards rebates, like you mentioned, rather than going into more government programs, unless those are actual, data-driven programs with proven results. I think infrastructure is really important too when it comes to these taxpayer dollars. That's an important way to get dollars back into our communities. And so that's something I think we need to look at as well. I think we also need to.
Now, hold on, before you go on, infrastructure is a broad term. And I agree with you on roads, bridges, even water. I tend to think that broadband and some of these other ideas, there's a lot more questionableness there in terms of the way this money is used and the benefits of that money. Everybody during COVID said, well, all we need is broadband across the state so that students can go to school online. Well, that's not really the solution or a highlight for, or an argument on behalf of state spending on behalf of broadband. So I just want to clarify that quickly with you.
Yeah, I don't think that there's a fundamental right to internet. I think it's super convenient, but that's different than a fundamental right. And so I've not supported the broadband type initiatives in the past. Number one, I'm fearful that by the time we actually have broadband at a meeting level, at the local level, there's going to be some other technology. And so here we have basically invested in dial-up. Beyond that, I think we have more pressing needs. Roads, bridges, water is a huge issue. And then, the other thing that people don't really like to talk about is electric generation. We are, at a national scale, taking offline these coal-fired power plants that have dispatchable, affordable electricity. And I understand the environmental concerns. I do. I don't dismiss those. But one of the things I think New Mexico should focus on is natural gas as a form of electric generation. We sit on some of the cleanest natural gas in the entire world. It's abundant. It's very affordable. And those are infrastructure projects that would help stabilize the grid in Albuquerque and make sure that the folks that have a difficult time making ends meet, they don't have to choose between paying their electric bill and putting food on the table. And again, I don't have a problem with renewables as long as that makes sense. And I see a world where renewables and fossil fuels can coexist. They're not opposites. So that's a piece of the infrastructure I'd like to see as well for New Mexico to invest in.
So without over dwelling on that, we've certainly talked extensively on this program about the shutdown of San Juan Generating Station, the issues with potential electricity reliability, our concerns with all of that, and the policies being put forth by the governor and many in the legislature to move towards zero carbon emissions. And it's another great transition point here in terms of topics. But how might the state use tax dollars in that kind of effort? Because obviously, first and foremost, this is coming up this summer. Now, there's long-term issues and concerns with electricity and the grid, but PNM was doing just fine until the Energy Transition Act came in and shut down San Juan Generating Station and created this very significant potential problem. How do you see that in the scope of state money for infrastructure?
That's a great question, Paul. I'm not a fan of taxpayer dollars floating down to private companies. I look at it more from the municipal and tribal utilities that right now are buying power out of state. I would like to see those utilities, these municipal and tribal utilities, be able to generate their own electricity using New Mexico natural gas and provide jobs right there in their communities. We talked previously on your podcast here about those high-paying jobs disappearing. That's one way that you can help bring those back.
All right, that's fair. And I know, obviously, City of Farmington, speaking of the Four Corners, that's your area of representation. They pulled the plug on the attempt to carbon capture there at San Juan Generating Station. So that particular solution is off the table. We're big fans of natural gas, of course, and would have liked to see that be a bridge fuel, at least to greater use of renewables. But do you think that horse has left the barn? Do you think there's any way to get natural gas back into the energy mix, or is that going to just require a different kind of transition in terms of the legislature and party control?
Well, I think this issue, renewables, electric generation using natural gas, this I think is going to become a huge issue, and it's going to be a winning issue, I submit, for the Republicans. And the reason why I say that is really quite sad. I think what we're going to see in the next few years, as you start to see brownouts and blackouts, is the people of Albuquerque are going to start to suffer, and we're going to wonder why. And you can even go beyond the brownouts and blackouts. Certainly, that will be the big, I think, flag being raised, but also rising utility rates is going to be a huge issue too. And we're not talking about something that is dirty on the output. With the advances in technology, you can take natural gas as an input, generate electricity, and the output is very, very clean, especially by world standards. And so you don't have to sacrifice the environment. We can still, take care and caution for the environment. We can still utilize a great industry in New Mexico that's the backbone of our budget. And, the third thing is that people can continue to have reliable and affordable electricity. And so, yeah, I think it is possible. I don't think it's going to happen this session, or probably not even the next session. But I do think in the recent future, in the near future, natural gas being added to the portfolio like we've seen in California, I think it's very doable.
Now, on those environmental issues, this governor has really prioritized that, and she's seen pushback in the legislature, even Democrat-controlled legislature did not give her things like the net zero or clean fuel standard. I'm assuming those and more will probably come up. What are you looking at and seeing coming down the pipe? Predominantly, I assume, bad legislation this session on kind of these energy and environmental issues that you think are should be on New Mexicans' radar screens.
Well, we could spend a whole podcast just talking about those.
Yeah,
those
I know.
But yeah, no, there are definitely going to be a laundry list of bad environmental bills. And for me, again, I just want to emphasize when I consider a bad environmental bill is, number one, it doesn't benefit the environment. That's the bottom line. And number two, it's going to make doing business harder in New Mexico. And number three, it's going to raise the prices for New Mexicans when it does come to energy or price at the pump, anything along those lines. So I'm okay with protecting the environment, but it needs to be a measure that actually protects it. So what we're going to see in this session, no doubt, is another attempt at the Green Amendment, which is a train wreck. Basically it gives private citizens, it amends the state constitution to give private citizens essentially a right to, and it uses really vague language, to a clean environment and these kinds of things, which really all it does is it puts the decision-making on each project in the courts, which is never good for taxpayers. I think you are going to see the Clean Fuel Standards Act again, all these rehash that we saw in the 30-day, many of those environmental bills are coming back. I do want to mention, though, a positive. So I've been working with a handful of our House members, both R's and D's, on a bill we call a regulatory timeframe bill. And so other states, what they have is they have when you apply for either a permit or a license, each agency has a specific time frame from which they must either approve or deny that permit. We don't have that law in New Mexico. Now, some agencies have their own internal timeframes. But what this bill would do is it directs each state agency to develop by rule a set time frame from which an agency must approve or deny a permit or license. And if they don't do it within that time frame, then it's deemed approved. And then the second thing this bill would do is similar, but what it requires is each agency has to have an adjudicatory process. So that way, if you're denied a permit or a license, you'll at least have the right to appeal that decision. And so I think that'll bring some certainty to industry. And certainly, one of the things I've heard from the oil and gas industry is that they would love to clean up orphaned and abandoned wells, but the permit process takes, sometimes years. And so this would sort of free that up to even do some cleaning up of the environment that industry is willing to do, but the red tape sort of seems to be a hurdle.
Yeah, and regulatory issues are something that costs no money really for the taxpayers. Not that we don't have money to spend, but just because we have kind of oodles of money available in Santa Fe doesn't mean that the proverbial line when you have a hammer, all the world is a nail. That's kind of a policy that's evergreen for New Mexico, is deregulating and even regulatory certainty. Even if you can't deregulate, at least improving those processes. So that's definitely a welcome idea. And kind of speaking at the crux of a lot of these issues, I know you're probably aware, and certainly your constituents up in R-Aztec and throughout the Four Corners are aware of the medical provider challenges facing the state of New Mexico and the lack of ready access to medical providers. Don't know if you saw or had time to take a little bit of a look at the LFC's report on Medicaid. And you mentioned right at the outset that nearly 50%. Well, the number LFC found is 47% in terms of our state being on Medicaid, and found that only 15% of secret shoppers in a study essentially that they did could find an appointment being on Medicaid, which kudos to the LFC for using the secret shoppers for first and foremost. But I know that this is on the agenda, especially the medical malpractice bill that passed in 2021 at the behest of Michelle Lujan Grisham and the Democrats. Any thoughts on the medical provider shortage and issues that you might be able to work on through this session?
Yeah, it's a huge issue, Paul. So, the medical malpractice, debacle, as I would call it, it took the cap, and now in January of 24, I think it's January 1 of 24, it's going up to around 4.5 million, I believe. And then it's going to spike up every year after that. And so what my local doctors have told me, and what I've heard from the medical society, is these docs, it's not just that they have a huge rate increase coming from their medical malpractice insurance. It's for some of them, especially the higher risk practices like a gynecologist, they're not going to be able to get insured at all with those type of limits. And so what's going to force, and this is why I think people need to understand, it's going to force one of two things. If I'm a local doc, I either have two options if I can't get malpractice insurance, or if I can't afford it. One is I sell my practice to a large corporation. I would submit that's not a good result, and certainly not the best result for the average patient. Or number two, I just shut down my practice and move out of state to a more friendly medical malpractice environment. Either way, the patient's losing. We're going to lose even more docs. And so, I've talked a lot about this. I know other legislators have as well. There are people on both sides of the aisle that see this and recognize it for the issue it is. I think there's going to be some bills that are going to be introduced in the 60-day to try to attack that piece of the med mal. We're going to try to also deal with some of the definitions that's created a problem. So let me just give a real quick example to kind of put some flesh on that. So Farmington has an outpatient surgery clinic that's 60% owned by private physicians and 40% owned by Salmon Regional. So it's still majority owned by private docs, individuals. The way the law was rewritten in 2021 is, though that type of clinic is going to be phased out of the patient compensation fund, so they're not going to be able to have the protection of the PCF or get medical malpractice insurance. And so that clinic is going to go away, and it serves a tremendous need in our community. And so that's one of the definitional fixes that need to be changed as well, is if you have a majority owned clinic owned by private physicians, there's no reason why they shouldn't be protected under the PCF.
Yeah. And of course, there's gross receipts tax issues when it comes to doctors. There's student loans and possibly giving them a break, an additional break, if you will, on student loans and all kinds of other policies. Hopefully, the forces that be up in Santa Fe will give some real thought to ways to make the situation better for doctors. But that medical malpractice bill and just repealing that completely would be, I think we'd agree, the very best way that could be addressed. But moving on, and really want to focus the last couple of minutes here on potentially voting legislation. We saw last year SB 8, which obviously came from the other body, but you had all kinds of crazy stuff in the first version. This was a bill that was amended repeatedly, and your good friend up there, Senator Bill Scher, also from the Four Corners, in his epic filibuster, killed that piece of legislation towards the end of the session, but allowing 16-year-olds to vote in local elections, creating a permanent absentee voter list, permitting people without official state ID to register to vote online, mailing absentee ballots to voters up to 35 days before the election day, and making people who get government benefits automatically registered vote. I mean, this is a grab bag of some of the craziest and worst ideas around And then it was already amended and amended again and finally killed. But I suspect that it's going to come back. So what are you hearing on that particular issue?
It is coming back, Paul. It will certainly be introduced. I know it will be. I've been told that.
How bad will it be? Do you have any idea on that?
I haven't seen like you mentioned, there are amendments and changes. So I don't know if it's the OG version or the multi-amended version. I'm not sure. But you just picked 2 or 3 of the things that you listed. I mean, any one of those are extremely troubling, I think. So yeah, this bill is coming back. I'm not sure what version, but it's certainly coming.
All right. Well, anything else before we let you go that you want to share about the upcoming session and kind of how you're going to try to make the process as painless as possible?
So, I think one of my focuses is going to be talking until we're blue in the face about the benefits of conservative policies. I think that's one thing as Republicans we don't do enough, or we don't do well enough. If you look at states that have gone from blue to red, there are populations that are flocking to those states, and I don't think that's incidental. I think it's a real life example of what happens when a state starts to embrace conservative principles. They really do make a difference in people's lives. When you give people more liberty, more freedom, lower taxes, more opportunities, better educations, these are the things I think that people want for them, their kids, their grandkids. And so look for us to be talking about the positives of conservative policies. And that's certainly, I know, one of my initiatives, and something that we're going to try to support with legislation as well.
Well, thank you very much for your time. And also thank you for taking on this responsibility and not just being a legislator, but being a leader, fighting the good fight in the minority up in Santa Fe. It's no doubt going to be challenging, but I think you're someone who really seems like you're doing this for all the right reasons, and that's good. I just wish you were Speaker of the House and not minority leader of the House. But hey, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So thank you again, Representative Ryan Lane and Minority Leader Lane.
Thanks, Paul. Enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.